Just to get started, I'm Lea Schick and I'm from the Alexander Institute. And we are a non-profit research organization, a GTS, Godkendt Technology Service. And one of our main purposes is to keep track on what's coming up of new technological trends. We are working solely within digitization and will try to bring information to the public sector and to SMEs on what's going on, what's coming. And Dataspaces is one of these new trends or new developments that is coming. So good. Just the practical, please keep your mics off when you're not speaking. We'll record everything and make it available online afterwards. Of course, you'll have the slides. And for this time, so this is the third in a series of webinars. You can see the webinars here. If this will let me switch. And in the two first, I think the program was a little bit too tight. We didn't have enough time for questions. So this time I've asked the speakers to keep it a bit shorter, and we'll have a bit more time, hopefully, for questions. And please, we'll have the questions along the way. So, or not during the presentations, but just right after the presentations. And you can either write them in the chat or you can raise your hand and then I'll let you speak through the mic. But please keep it short because we have a very tight program. So as I said, this is the third in a row of webinars trying to dive more into what is Dataspaces. We are particularly focusing on the energy sector. This is both because a lot is happening in the energy sector in Denmark, also because the whole series of webinars is funded by the Danish Energy Cluster Denmark. So thank you for funding this. And the two first webinars, they are available. So if you haven't seen them, you can go in and see them on the webpage. There's a link in the bottom. And just to let you know, we won't be diving into, or I won't be going into what is Dataspaces. So this is in the first webinar. We don't have time for that each time. So, and for each of our webinars, we've made a partnership with an organization particularly relevant for the topic. And today the topic is governance and the legal frameworks around Dataspaces, and of course the Agency of Digitization, Digitaliseringsstyrelsen, is our companion for this time. So Adam is with us. And we will have a presentation from him in the end. Also, we're having this expert panel that we're starting next week. A lot of you joining in today, well, or not a lot because that's a smaller group, but you'll be joining us for 2 physical days where we'll actually be trying to get our fingers dirty and get more into how can we actually do Dataspaces. And the 5th webinar will be some recommendation from this expert group. So this is just a setting around today's program. And for the program, we have, I'll do a short introduction to what is governance in general. How can we talk about governance in different levels? Then we have Marco Tupainen with us from Finland, and Marco is part of the Dataspace Support Center, where you have been, still is very involved in making the blueprint for the governance around Dataspaces. And then we have experiences from 2 existing Dataspaces that are already up and running and have already been developing this governance framework. So this is the Finnish traffic data ecosystem and the tourism Dataspace dates. Then we'll have a visit from the EU Commission. We will have from DG Connect, Johan Bodenkamp with us, who will talk about the European Data Innovation Board, which has just been or is in the midst of being established right now. And not least, we'll have Adam Arndt from the Agency of Digitization. So this is the program. Good. I will start with my presentation. So Today, the agenda for my presentation is I'll talk. I'm looking up here because I see my slides up here. This is always a bit weird. I'll be talking a bit about what are the legal frameworks around data spaces, and how is that connected to the Commission's overall vision. And then I'll be talking about what is governance, and I have tried to divide it into 3 different levels of governance, where I'll both be talking about the more, what you call intra data space, and then what we can call inter data space within one data space. And then I'll talk about the specific role involved in a data space called a data intermediary. So the European Commission has made in 2020 this data strategy, and there's one kind of overall vision is to make one EU single market for data. So a market where we can better exchange data with one another, and this data exchange should happen on some principles. And these principles are very important when we talk about data governance or data space governance, because this is the overall principles that we actually should make the governance framework around. This is stuff like data sovereignty, transparency, security, fairness, data altruism you will hear about a bit later. And below the principles, we have some requirements about interoperability. You'll hear a lot about that. Findability, security, privacy preservation, data governance is placed here, but that's of course also a tool for achieving the other stuff. Data sovereignty, and very important, trustworthiness. So I think the governance framework is very much about creating this trustworthiness in data spaces. And then below we have some of the features or the components that should enable these requirements and principles. So if we look at the legislation, so EU is proposing common European data spaces. There's a lot of funding for it. There's a lot of different stuff happening. But one of the very important things is that there's a lot of legislation being made, or that has already been made around or backing up the creation of data spaces. So we have the GDPR and the Open Data Directive. We'll hear about the Open Data Directive from Adam later. But they are prior to data spaces, but they're very important when we talk about how to do governance in data spaces. Then we have the 2 main legislations, the Data Governance Act and the Data Act, and we'll hear about them both from Adam and from Johan. So I won't be going more into it, but the most important is that they are the ones in which some of the very important stuff about data space is being described. The Interoperable Europe Act has been proposed but not decided upon yet. This is also very important because interoperability is one of the main things. So here we'll have some of the broader stuff about how do we do interoperability. Then out on the side, we have Digital Market Act, Digital Service Act, and AI Act, and the implementation of high value data sets. These are all also very connected to data spaces, but where it's not directly mentioned in. So this slide you have probably seen before, those of you who have been part of the previous webinars, but we need to just establish the overall, what is a data space? A data space is defined as a decentralized infrastructure for trustworthy data sharing and exchange in data ecosystems based on commonly agreed principles. And this is the overall description in the design principle for data spaces, a now old document, but I think still the document that most actors working with data spaces are referring back to, because this is where the main principles of data spaces have been described. But the important thing is here is these commonly agreed principles, and this is actually what we are talking about. How do we make these commonly agreed principles? And as you probably know, it's imagined that we'll have data spaces within different sectors. You need to make data governance within each sector, or data spaces within each sector. but you also need to make sure that the data spaces from each particular sector will be interoperable with other sectors so that you can actually share data across. This is from the Dataspace Support Center, from their Insight series on governance. There's a link in the bottom. I'll highly recommend to go and see this. This is, I have just found out this morning already an old slide. So this is explaining the building blocks in a data space. On the top, we have the governance, and here it's only 3 different blocks. I know Marco will present a very new version of this, but it's mainly concerned with business, governance, and legal framework. And below we have the technical blocks. We'll talk about that in the next webinar. But what I want to highlight with this slide is that even though we have the technical building blocks in the bottom, the governance is also very importantly also defining in a data space what technical blocks are we going to use in this particular data space. So they're not totally separated. And also what is important is what I most commonly hear is that the technical building blocks, yes, they are almost already there, or at least they are not the difficult ones to build. What is really difficult is the governance layer. This is the big task for us to actually figure out. So today we're talking about the most difficult part of data spaces, I think. This is my figure that most of you have also seen before. Try to explain what's happening in a data space and how is this related to the stuff besides. So over in the left corner, you have the European Data Innovation Board, the national authorities who should back up data spaces in a country and also make sure there's a link to EU. And we have the standardization and certification bodies. Those are all very important for data governance. In the middle, we have, let's imagine this is the energy data space. We have a data space, we have a governance body or an authority, or this could be an organization. I've just been at the webinar for the new establishment of the Green Deal Data Space Association. So this is a joint forces between some of the most important partners who say we want to build a data space together, and they are the ones defining the governance structure. Then we have the data intermediary, which is a very important role. I'll get back to that, but this is the one that will actually in many ways be enacting what's described in the governance framework. And then of course we have the data holders and data users who are going to exchange data. I won't get into that. And in the bottom, we have some of the technical building blocks, which are also being described in the governance framework. So what is governance? It's a very wide concept here in this, I think, it's a relatively new document called European Dataspaces. I think it's a really nice document to read if you want to get more into it. But here data governance is described as, or it said that data governance within a common European data space should set out framework outlining clear roles, duties, standards, responsibilities to ensure that data is appropriately protected while also supporting data sharing and openness of data mobility. So I think this double thing of both enabling more sharing but also protecting is the hard part. So good data governance can facilitate a fair data economy, address the cross-border nature of data flows and data storage practices, as well as helping to foster public trust. It should include an assessment of different business models for data sharing and put into place contractual agreements to enable data flows between different stakeholders. And of course, there's a longer description. And on the right side, you can see a nice illustration of what governance includes. We will not be going into that, but I think the important thing is here to actually notice that it's both laws, policies, some of the overall visions. It's about the organizational part. How is the data space organized? What key actors are there? The technical and operational stuff going into it. And then everything, the oversight and coordination, which is the European Data Innovation Board, the national authorities. it's really nice to look more into, but we won't have the time to do it here. So Dataspace Support Center has this glossary. I know Marco will also be bringing this up, but it's a nice place to go to when you think, what is this? When we hear about different notions of dataspace. But here they explain the data governance, say that regarding dataspaces, governance happens in different levels. So there's laws and regulations, governance of common building blocks and assets, sector-specific inter-data space governance, governance of particular data spaces, self-regulation of each participant of a data space. So that's a lot. And I've tried to divide it into 3 chunks, and this is only my way of trying to understand it. So we have the macro level, or the inter-data space. This is what is concerned with how do we make interoperability between different data spaces. This is also where the legislation and EU bodies are included. Then we have the intra-data space, which it's often called. This is this particular data governance framework for one particular data space. This is also where all the sector-specific things are. And then we have the intermediaries, and I'll come more into that. So the micro level, I think I've already said this, but this is what should be built on the EU societal values, the interoperability between data spaces. And this is where we'll be able to get a lot of information from the European Data Innovation Board and the national member states. Then we have for the one specific data space, the intra-data space, it says that a major task of Dataspace Initiative is to develop the governance framework that contains the rules, practices of dataspace governance, management, and operations. We use the term governance body, and I think Marco will actually get to another term. So this is totally a thing in development all the time. We'll use that to refer to the role that a partner of the Dataspace Initiative performs as it bears the responsibility of creating and maintaining the governance framework. So with the dataspace governance framework in place, various ecosystem parties can commit to the framework. So this is the most important thing, is that there is going to be a specific framework that you as a member of Dataspace commit to. And when you've committed to that, you've also you're part of ensuring the trust in a data space. I think I'll just jump over this. This is just to say, for example, in energy, this is also where we have to look at the specifics of a sector-specific data space. So what do we need to look into of energy policies if we make an energy data space? The Dataspace Support Center has made this checklist, what they call the BLUFT framework: business, legal, operational, functional, technical. So if you want to start thinking about how to do the data space governance, these are some of the questions that you need to adhere to when you create your governance framework. And now I'll just use my one last minute to talk about the data space intermediary. So this is the data space enabler that is technically and legally connects one or more data members in the data space, and thereby enabling them to establish a relationship and execute the data transactions with other members. And I think what is important is that this data intermediary, that's the place where you can find data. This is where you, through the data intermediary, you do the contracts, you negotiate how you'll get access to the data. And this needs to be like a trust-bringing role that acts as a neutral facilitator and enables the reuse of data. And if we go down to the Data Governance Act, there's 2 different data intermediaries explained. There's the Data Altruistic Organization. This is an entity that it's a new entity that should come up. I think we mostly know it from the My Data movement, but this is an entity that should make it possible for individuals, companies to say, we want to give free access to our data, and we want to give access to it only on these terms, these conditions, for these purposes. And then on the other side, we have the data intermediary service providers. This is more of a commercial relationship or like a marketplace where you can sell data. These are the ones that is explained in the Data Governance Act, and also the ones, there's a lot of specifications on what you're allowed to do and what you are not allowed to do as if you want to be one of these roles. And you can also live up to specific rules laid out by the EU Commission, and then you can get this stamp as a recognized data intermediary. But I think a lot of people are saying these are very unclear ideas of how this data intermediary should actually, who wants to make these data intermediaries, how can we do it, what kind of business cases can we make on top of when we want to make an intermediary service like that. And now the member states need to actually help foster these new roles. And this very new, I think it's 2 weeks old, report called Mapping the Landscape of Data Intermediaries has the purpose of saying these are only 2 very narrow roles of what data intermediaries are, and they want to talk about a more inclusive data governance and broaden out the different ways we can have data intermediaries. Because of time, I'll just jump to this. So they say there's these 2 different roles that is described in the Data Governance Act, but they actually look through the literature and say, based on that, we can say that there's 6 different kind of data intermediation services or types of data intermediation services that already exist out there that lives up to the EU value set. So there's also some like data brokers that they have said this doesn't really live up to what is in the Data Governance Act. But the idea with this report is actually to help people like Adam to say, let's look at the data intermediary role as much broader than the 2 very specific ones explained in the Data Governance Act. And they actually, for each of these 6 types, they go through business models, but also some of the challenges. And of course, the challenges are very much contained around how do we do a sustainable business plan for such a data intermediary. So this is all that I have the time to say about this. So maybe it has brought up questions. I think there's a hand. I just need to see who it is. Ulla, yeah. Let me see. Ulla, have you posted a question in the chat, or do you want to turn on your mic? Ulla, are you there? Maybe it's not a hand. Then we have Henrik Madsen. Can you just quickly say who you are also if you turn on your mic?
This was wrong. Sorry for that.
Okay. So okay, it was the wrong hand. But are there any questions? I know that I had to go through my slides way too quickly, but I hope that you can, if there's some of it that you want to look more into, I've put in links for everything. And Ulla writes, sorry about that. So that was also not a hand. Good. If there are no questions, I think we'll just jump on to Marco, because I know that you have a lot that you would like to say as well. So our next speaker is Marco, and you're both the CEO of 1001 Lakes and IT Development House, and you're also very involved in international data space, IDSA, sorry, and the Dataspace Support Center. So I look forward to hear your presentation.
Well, thank you, Leah. And yeah, indeed, I do have many hats, and one that I may have not even mentioned to you is that I'm also affiliated with the academic institute called Aalto University in Finland. So I'm the computer science department in Aalto. But in this context, so mainly these two. So I'm the CEO of Finnish company called 1001 Lakes, and we want to be experts in data sharing, data spaces, data ecosystems. And also that I have been participating quite a lot in these European level initiatives and especially IDSA, International Dataspace Association. I know that there have been speakers before from IDSA, and maybe there is some repetition, but so be it. And also, well, thank you, Leah, for this intro. I also think a little bit like, okay, well, what will I have new, because you had so many things in such a short presentation. But maybe I'd try to go a little bit deeper into some of these areas and just very quickly. So the company, so as said, so we want to facilitate data ecosystems, help different organizations to figure out what's in it for them when they are sharing data, and then build these ecosystems very concretely. And there are a couple of more specific things that we have been involved in. One is this rulebook work, and I will come back to that in my presentation later. Then in various different ways, we have been involved in data ecosystems in various sectors. At the EU level, for example, we are in the coordination support action for the agricultural data space, which is currently being kind of building a roadmap on how to make this common European data space happen for agriculture. And then, well, next month there is a media data space project that's starting where we are also participating. So again, looking at this from various different industry viewpoints and also hopefully finding these connections. So what's the connection between energy and built environment and mobility, for example, so that those kinds of things we want to be also good at. And then we want to participate in these international initiatives and especially European initiatives beyond the projects, and that's, for example, the IDSA membership, where we well, I'm one of the co-leaders in so-called IDSA rulebook working group, and again I'll talk about that in a moment a little bit more. But here, this is something that the Finnish Innovation Fund Sitra published just yesterday, and I just wanted to kind of take that also as a framework for our discussion, and I think it sort of repeats what Leah already said. But the story is that when we talk about data governance now from the point of view of Europe, and that's the scope for the session today. So there are the legal regulatory tsunami, as people are saying. So many new regulations coming that has to do with data, has to do with AI, and all of this is building the framework in which we are all working. And then you have the EU level. So, I mean, and we will discuss that later also, I think, in this session. So how are we planning to organize these EU level bodies that help in figuring out what the right practices are, and how do we develop them and distribute them, and, who says what are the right ways to kind of govern? So again, can we do that more at the European level? And then there is an important role for the member state level activities. And again, now the picture is a little bit, quite heterogeneous. Some countries are more organized than other countries. And how do you actually kind of have this member state level coordination and understanding? How do you participate in all of these activities is very much, being built as we speak, but it's really important that we get that right. And then the third level is all of these data space initiatives, which then span across different countries and maybe even different industries and so forth. And you need to have a governance structure for those. So in the big picture, so this is a little bit what's going on. Then Leah already mentioned several times the word interoperability. So when we talk about governance and data space governance, so the question is very much, well, how can we find some kind of a way where we kind of are interoperable. We define ways to be interoperable, and here I kind of I borrowed from this paper by called New European Interoperability Framework, these 4 layers. So you have the legal layer at the top, and that's sort of the one story there is also that okay, it's fine that we have, for example, European regulation, but then member states have their own regulation. If we talk about health, for example, there is an enormous pile of regulations in each member state. And then you can also look at this problem like beyond Europe, and if we want to make sure that, well, the jurisdiction in Finland and at the EU level also matches with something that's going on, for example, in Asia, in, let's say, Japan or China. So then we have a whole different level of, interoperability questions when we talk about legal level interoperability. Then you have the organizational level. So the different stakeholders, what are their goals? What are their expectations? Why are they in this sort of data space business at all? What's in it for them? What are their responsibilities? What are the business processes that are supposed to be supported by the data space? So that's the organizational level. And again, agreeing on things at that level between the different stakeholders is an interoperability task. And then when you go more to the implementation side and maybe the technical side, so then you have the semantic level, which is sort of how do we share data? What's the meaning of the data? And really kind of these sort of shared descriptions, shared data models comes back in a big way to the story when we have these, relatively complex sets of different organizations, or we're trying to kind of, use each other's data. So it is a semantic interoperability problem. And then you have the technical layer. You have the building blocks at the technical level. How do you ensure who's who? What's the identity and access management, tech wise? How do you connect the different data sources to something that is a data space? What are the connectors and so forth? So that's the technical level interoperability. All of these have to happen at the same time. Then also Leah already mentioned, and I come back also to this a little bit later still once more, but this sort of, well, okay, also we have this question of how do we figure out interoperability within a data space, so intra-data space between the parties of a single data space instance. And then you have the inter-data space. So you have multiple different instances of data spaces up and running, and they should be somehow be compatible and at some level be able to have a sort of a governance between them. And this is complex. I can say that up front, and there is no kind of a silver bullet yet, especially for the second one. But work in progress in many different ways. Anyway, so this is sort of the different ways to structure interoperability. I think you may have seen this picture in previous webinars, and I won't go into details, but as said, I'm, have been spending a lot of time with IDSA, and IDSA has this, already maybe 3-4 years old picture that they use, or IDSA is using to describe that this is data space. So you have the providers and you have the consumers and you have connectors with which these are providing their data to something that's called a common data space for data sharing. And then you have usage policies that define that, okay, the data that I'm providing can be used under such and such conditions. And then on the other side, you kind of also have, you have to adhere to the policies. And then in between, you have all of these different intermediaries or roles that can be kind of facilitating what's going on in the data space. And Leah already explained that this whole story of intermediaries is very much tied to DGA, Data Governance Act, and we will probably hear more about that in other presentations later today. But it's also somewhat still, well, I mean, clarification is needed. And here I can give a kind of a heads up that also IDSA is publishing kind of a DGA intermediary related paper in coming weeks, which tries to also clarify from the data space viewpoint what is a data intermediary. A little bit like the GRC paper that Leah already referred to. But one of the things that's not in this picture and what needs to be in the picture is something that is the governance body, as Leah was saying. Now, the latest term for this is Dataspace Governance Authority, which is a governance body, but this is a more clearer kind of description, hopefully, what kind of a governance body it is. So some kind of authority that is in the data space that sort of, and I will explain later what the roles are, but it has this sort of authority role, the something that glues the parties together, defines policies and so, overall policies, membership criteria, whatnot. So that's the term that has been used lately. And again, this is work in progress. Dataspaces Support Center was mentioned. Glossary is one of the works that DSSC is really heavily now, pushing that, yeah, we need these common definitions, but it also shows that this is hard because there are several different versions. And well, you already saw that Leah was using terms that now in this latest one that I picked from DSSC glossary, which was 2 days ago, so have already somewhat changed. But the ideas are the same, but we need to be kind of clearer in what terms we are using. And there, I think this work by Dataspaces Support Center is helping a lot. There is a new definition, maybe a clearer definition on the data space, I hope. And one thing there that is, again, new is that data space is defined by having something which has a governance framework. So if you don't have a governance framework for your thing where you're sharing data, then it's not a data space. And again, I think that's an important addition to this definition, especially from the point of view of this session. Of course, then Dataspace has participants and they have different roles. The roles are kind of hopefully somehow logically defined. And dataspace governance is the processes through which a dataspace is developing and maintaining and enforcing the governance framework in that dataspace. Fine. And then the governance framework itself, principles, standards, policies, agreements, practices that apply to the governance, management, and operations of a data space, and then enforcement of those as well. So that's what's called a data space governance framework. Then more specifically, it has been kind of specified here that there is a thing called Dataspace Rulebook. And Rulebook is then for an instance of a dataspace, a kind of documentation that this is our governance framework. It sort of sets the governance framework in something which is shared. We all adhere to this set of governance framework principles and practices, and that's described in the rulebook. And then you have the Dataspace Governance Authority, which I already mentioned before. So I think this is sort of the very latest, and again, not set in stone, kind of can be challenged, will be probably challenged. But again, as you can see, it's work in progress. I hope we are making progress. One kind of also maybe going back a few years when this was discussed in the context of the paper that Leah also mentioned and showed the very top part of this picture in design principles for data spaces. So there we had this idea that there are layers of governance, and I think 4 layers of governance sort of emerge out of this. So you have the bottom layer, which can be called soft infrastructure layer, and there you have common building blocks for both technical side and the governance side. And I'll come back to that in a second. But for example, IDSA, the role of the International Dataspace Association is to figure out what those soft infrastructure building blocks should be and how they should be used, and sort of what is the way how you can implement things on top of those soft infrastructure components. And that's the role of IDSA. But then on top of that, you have more domain-specific governance. You have sector-specific principles. You have sector-specific data models. If you're in mobility, you have different data models that you would have in agriculture or in health and so forth. So the story is, well, who governs those? Who makes sure that those are shared, understood, kind of, really fit the needs? So that requires governance of its own, and that's at the domain level typically. Of course, you have some things like, well, let's say geodata, which spans across different domains, but it's also a kind of a set of its own, which again needs governance. So how do we describe geographical data? So again, but there is this sort of intermediary level that's at the domain, and then you have the ecosystem layer. But here, okay, now I have kind of made a separation here that you have the ecosystem governance where you have multiple different parties where you might even have cross connections between this energy data sharing thing in Denmark and this energy data sharing thing maybe in Sweden, and they have some joint way of connecting across and have common principles, but they are not the same dataspace instance. You would have the energy dataspace instance in Denmark and in Finland and Sweden. Maybe it doesn't have to be, but it could be. So then you have at the top you have the governance at that level of dataspace instance, and there you need to have this dedicated dataspace governance authority. Okay. Now the building blocks, which was in the previous picture, was at the bottom, and Leah also mentioned that there has been recently quite a lot of work on this green part, the organizational and governance. So the top is called governance, the bottom is called technical, and then the top one, well, again, well, maybe the terms are a little bit still kind of in flux, because then the top ones, yeah, they are called governance building blocks, but then inside that now there is business governance and legal. Maybe that's not the most helpful. Let's say organizational, how do you actually get the non-technical things agreed upon? Maybe that's the best way to describe the top one. And again, it's a draft. It's something that's still very much open for discussion. So also my kind of somewhat vagueness here is reflecting that this again is not set in stone. The DSSC team is doing their damnedest at this moment to get the first blueprint 1.0 out. This was out for a public consultation a couple of weeks back. But the story is that this top part has been heavily now worked on. There is work on kind of what are the business building blocks that are common? How can we have things like data product definitions? How can we have better definitions of what these collaborative business models are? And again, the story of data intermediary. How do you define a data intermediary, and what's the business of data intermediary? So kind of these are things that DSSC has been looking into and kind of is describing as building blocks from the business side. Then you have the governance things, so the data governance framework, roles and responsibilities, decision-making rules, policies. Those are the governance building blocks. And then you have the legal things. So of course you want to be regulatory compliant, and then things like, well, does DGA apply, or what has this to do with maybe personal data, GDPR, or member state level legislation. So that's all there. And then you have the contractual framework, so the actual contracts that set up, legally this governance structure, and that's a building block of its own in this characterization. So anyway, so this top part is something that DSSC is now heavily working on, and please follow this from the, within the next weeks, I would expect that the blueprint 1.0 will come out, and the top part is the one that has been most heavily worked on recently. Okay, so that was what Dataspaces Support Center is doing at the moment. Then from IDS side or IDSA side, couple of stories about what's also called there a rule book. Maybe this is somewhat confusing again, because this rule book really is sort of for IDS implementers. When people are implementing something on top of IDS, which is International Dataspaces Standards, and its architecture, its reference architecture, open source implementations, and so forth. Sort of what are the policies and recommendations and kind of practices that IDSA wants to see its members to take up and distribute when IDS is used. And so that's what the IDSA rulebook stands for. And it's divided in these 4 parts. So there are functional requirements like separations of duties of participants in data spaces and roles, definitions of what's mandatory and what's not mandatory when you have a data space, and then this whole story of how do you actually implement data sovereignty inside a data space. Then you have references to these technical agreements and practices inside IDSA and what are kind of the rules and practices around them, more like looking inwardly towards IDSA itself. And then operational agreements, sort of how do you have like life cycle of IDS and life cycle of these policies in sync and well managed, and then kind of guidance on how do you run a specific data space instance, how do you get it up and running. And it's very much related also to something that that you saw in the BLOFT thinking that was published by DSSC. So similar thing, helping. The rulebook helps to kind of the different entities to figure out, okay, I need to do this and this and this to get my thing operational. And then there is a basis for legal agreements, which again actually borrows now quite a lot from other piece of work that I will refer back to in a sec. So this is sort of the IDSA rulebook. Maybe very briefly some of the things inside what's kind of
Marco, just
defined.
I know that you have a lot of slides left, but we only have 4 minutes left also for the questions. So
okay, I'll hurry up 2 minutes. So first of all, so there's this
one question. Yeah.
Thanks, Leah. So first of all, so there is this policy thing. So, okay, what kinds of policies there are in general? So you have membership policies at the data space level, you have access policies, you have contract policies, you have usage policies, and these have to do with kind of different levels of, entities that are described in the data space. Then I mentioned this data space governance authority already before, and this IDSA rulebook is kind of specifying the different things that this governance authority is supposed to do. So establishing policies and rules, issuing membership credentials, regulating the life cycle of membership, who is a member, who is not a member, how do you figure out if somebody is a member, and so forth. And then it can provide other services like auditing service or marketplace service or vocabularies and so forth. That's defined by the data space members, what they want the data space governance authority to do. So there are sort of mandatory and optional services that this authority can provide. Maybe in the interest of time, I'll skip this, but you get the materials, and this is actually in the IDSA rulebook, but this sort of tries to clarify also a little bit how this different, how the process actually goes around the data space governance authority, and that there are also different ways, more kind of organizationally. I mean, most of the governance authority that we've seen so far are centralized. So there's one kind of central entity somewhere that kind of takes this responsibility, but it can be also more distributed. You could have a DAO, for example, that is acting as the data space governance authority. So it doesn't have to be a centralized structure. And lastly, so well, one more after this. So we have worked with Citra on this model, Citra rulebook model. Maybe Janne will refer to this in a sec when he's having his presentation on the mobility side. But it's a kind of it's an open, first of all, available for all. It's a template on when you need to define the tech, legal, business, ethical side of your data space instance. Where do you start? Well, you can start with this rulebook template, and it has this checklist, go through these questions. It has, model contracts. It has, different parts that you can use to define things that clarify for your ecosystem to get going. And this is, as said, it's provided by Citra. The current version is 2.0, and the work is ongoing there. And the last point, and again, maybe Leah already mentioned this, but I just want to highlight that when we go to this level of inter-data space interoperability and really kind of try to figure out how these different instances of data spaces are going to kind of be working together, then having these member state level coordination things and, European data innovation board like structures that really guide in this interoperability will be hugely important. But we should not underestimate the complexity of what's going to be needed when this is actually will be up and running in a big scale. That was my presentation. Thank you for listening, and happy to answer questions.
Luckily, Janne has answered already some of the questions out in the chat, so I'll jump to Frederick's question, and I think it's very much related to your last part. He asked if there's a focus on cross-data or intra-data space governance authority conflicts in terms of conflicting interests and rules. Is that something, yeah, you can say what happens when there's conflicts?
Well, I would love to have a short and simple answer, but I don't. I mean, this is one of those things, for example, that when we are now in this agri data space project for setting up the future common European data space for agriculture. So, okay, well, how do we resolve if the data space instance that's going on, for example, in Belgium, and the one in France, and one in Denmark, and one in Finland don't actually agree, and then there is a conflict, there is something goes wrong, or the principles are not aligned. How do we create a structure where those can be discussed, can be resolved? Who does that?
We can pause this and maybe see if there's something Johan can talk about.
Yeah,
I don't know if that's something the Data Innovation Board will be dealing with.
I would hope that the Data Innovation Board could be one of those bodies that actually can help in those kind of conflict resolution.
And then we just very shortly, Henrik Madsen is asking about the MIMs, the minimum operability mechanisms. What about them? Do you work with them when you work with these different layers of interoperability? Because they have been approved by you and they're work in progress in ISO.
Yeah, so I think what Henrik is referring to is especially the MIMs that are coming from the work that Smart City people, Open and Agile Smart Cities, OASC has been working on, and yes, so it is connected. There is a link. The rule book mechanism, for example, so we use that in an exercise with the city of Helsinki to define rules around personal data when you are sharing data across different providers that are providing services for the citizens, and that was used as a blueprint for the MIM for personal data sharing that OASC is defining. So I think, Henrik, there is a connection. Maybe that connection could be even closer, but I'm not too worried about that.
Okay, thank you. We'll have to jump straight on to Janne also, because I know that Janne will have to leave afterwards. So we want to make sure that we'll hear from Janne. So welcome, Janne. You are orchestrating the whole mobility data space in Finland, and you've been operating for quite a while, I know, by now. So we're very curious to hear how you work with this, and you've already put a lot of really helpful links out in the chat. So
sure, yeah. Let me share my screen. Can you see this? Okay.
Yes, perfect.
Okay, so good morning. My name is Janne Lautana. I'm the Chief Ecosystem and Technology Officer with FinTraffic. Here are my contact links if you want to ask for more information. A little bit about background about FinTraffic. We are a unique company in the world. We have all modes of traffic under one roof. So we are doing traffic management and control for both railway traffic, air navigation services, road traffic, and vessel traffic services. We are also responsible of aggregating, managing, and publishing traffic-related data in Finland. And if you talk about the data, we are actually providing a wide range of different type of data and services to different type of stakeholders. And key domains include situation awareness on all modes of traffic, logistic related data, and public transport related data. And here are a few examples of what kind of services we are providing. I actually provided some links also there. So there's open data APIs, there's situation awareness services, train public transport related services, feedback channel, and other services. And there are various types of sources. Quite a bit of the data comes from us, from traffic management and control, but there are also external parties who are who are providing the services. For example, the PTAs provide the public transport related information. And we are doing it in scale, 10 billion API calls a year. And users include companies like Google, here, Apple, PTAs, whatnot. Then the question, and let me actually do a reshare. I think I forgot to put my audio on. Yes, let's reshare. So, okay, why do we do this? First of all, digitalization is an effective tool to make a positive impact into traffic. In Finland, 20% of the emissions are caused by traffic. 13% of companies and households' money is spent on logistics and traffic cost. And of course, there's a huge potential, and we believe that digitalization is a unique possibility for creating better services, being more effective, and creating growth for Finland. And okay, what do we try to achieve? I have a quick 2-minute video. Hopefully this is coming okay. I provided the link in the chat. So
the year is 2030. Finland has the safest, smoothest, and most environmentally friendly traffic in the world. Cars are increasingly becoming self-driving, and more of them are running on electricity and other low-emission energy sources. Ships and trains are remote controlled, drones deliver packages and perhaps even carry people. E-biking is the new national pastime. This trend was fueled by everything being connected to everything. Here in Finland, we have something new, a real-time status of the entire transport system, a digital twin. This digital layer has formed a platform for the growth of entirely new services and businesses. It has created a unique transport ecosystem, a network of enterprises and experts with shared goals, working towards shared success. This is now Finland's new competitive advantage. All the parts of the transport system now exchange information with each other like we have never seen before. Operating capacity in the air, on the rails, on the roads, and at sea is now much more efficiently used, and maintenance costs have gone down. Smoothly running public transport with on-demand services has become a viable alternative to private cars. The delivery time for a product from the deepest central Finland to the world markets is shorter than ever, and Finland is well on the way to achieving zero emissions across the board in traffic. But the main thing is that there are now many fewer traffic accidents, yet people and goods still get to where they're going much faster than before. Finland now has the safest, smoothest, and most environmentally friendly traffic in the world because we lead the field in leveraging transport information. We have created a new expertise, a new export, and something we all Finns can be proud of.
So, and how do we do that? One key aspect is the creation of traffic data ecosystem. It currently has more than 170 leading mobility organizations, operators, authorities, academia, service providers, cities, ports, whatnot. And basically, we want to make data flow in an interoperable format. And we have defined our key targets, our key goals. We have the governance model and try to leverage best practices across different type of organization. The building blocks for this ecosystem, collaboration, we have shared vision, shared goals. We have, of course, coordination made by FinTraffic, and we try to enable joint development, joint investment. There, of course, need to be the data and infrastructure, both the technical infrastructure, standard data models, standard APIs, certain shared services. But one of the key things is really the governance and the legal framework, what we call rule book. So it's fair data economy rules and agreements, templates, conventions, etc. So highly simplified picture, but basically it's these three main building blocks. And if we go into the rule book area, so basically it's a many-to-many agreement, legal agreement. So instead of everybody doing one-to-one agreements, we have the many-to-many agreements which define kind of rules for sharing, provision, sharing and provision of data-driven services, and the kind of governance of this collaboration. And the aim is to free up more data with or without a fee, with commonly agreed interoperable formats. Basically, we have leveraged the free transfer data economy playbook. There's the link which I provided already in the chat, and our rulebook is freely downloadable if you want to have a look on that. So there's the governance part, then there's the kind of technology part. This is the capability set that we have defined that we want to build. FinTraffic has certain areas, and then there are other companies who are taking part of some of the other areas. But basically, you have to have a holistic view on the capability set that needs to be there in order to be able to provide the data and the services. One example, just one. What have been accomplished in Finnish ports. Traditionally in the ports, there's loads of emails, phone calls, very chaotic environment because of the data sharing is inefficient. Nobody knows what is the kind of situation in the ports. We created a data sharing platform where all the parties in the port can share information, including, for example, artificial intelligent enabled estimated time of arrival for the vessels, which is shared, for example, with the truck driver, so they don't have to wake up in the middle of the night just to go to the port to see that, oh, the vessel is late. So huge improvement in the efficiency in the port and kind of situation awareness sharing between different parties, and everybody can better organize what they are doing. That's my very quick presentation. If you need more information, please do not hesitate to contact me, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Great. We have a hand from Anders Bennett Terkelsen, who has a question.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. I was wondering,
Anders, can you just say where you're from? So
yeah,
I'm
from Evi here in Denmark, which is a multi-supply company. I was wondering, when you talk about the ecosystems, the data ecosystems that you define and implement, how do you work with data standards? I guess that it could potentially be a problem that you have different interpretations of basically the same data entity across different APIs. How do you deal with that?
Well, it requires discussion and collaboration. So one example, for example, from the public transport is that there are certain standard profiles, and we have adopted the Nordic profile for NetEx, for example, and between different stakeholders who are utilizing that particular standard and that profile, we are further defining the kind of conventions for how do we use it in Finland. So we love standards, and we try to utilize as much global standards as possible, but in many cases you have to define the Finnish conventions, and it's a matter of kind of discussing and agreeing together how do we utilize those.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Otherwise, I just have a very quick one. So, Janne, you're both the authority, the Dataspace Governance Authority. Do you also have a marketplace, or you are also the data intermediary? Is that
Yes.
right? So, and do you have also a marketplace or a business model for how you actually exchange the data, or is that in the?
So basically, our roles come from the European Union directive. So we are a so-called national access point, NAP, and we are bound to gather and provide data related to, for example, security-related data in Finland free of charge to all the parties. So we are a government-owned company. We are not an authority, but we are 100% owned by the government, and we have been assigned this task. So we try not to mess up the market, let's put it, so that we are not, we are getting the revenue 99 point something% from government, basically.
Okay.
And we try to enable others to be successful. Yes, we have data catalog, but it's not something. Our goal is not to make as much money. Our goal is to make other companies and other organizations make as much money as possible.
Great, thank you. Thank you. We have to jump to the next speaker, even though I have 10 more questions, but Nuria, thank you very much for your presentation, Janne. And Nuria, I look forward to hearing from your tourism data space.
Thank you very much, Leah. Let me share the screen and you tell me if this works.
Yes, it works. We just need to put in full screen. Yes.
Yeah,
perfect.
First of all, well, thank you very much for the invitation to be here. It's a pleasure. My name is Nuria de Lama. I'm consulting director at IDC, which is a market intelligence company. Basically, we provide predictions and a lot of data about the market, and we understand how the buyers of technology react and how the providers should sell their services and their products. I'm coming here today to present a very specific data space. The tourism data space is not as developed as the one that was mentioned before. Here we are in the specification phase. You know that the Commission has launched a number of projects focused on different verticals, and we are still in the design phase, but we are already finalizing the project. So I will try to make a brief presentation of what is our proposal. And I would like also to mention that my company, in fact, IDC was the coordinator of the OpenDI project that created somehow the first document of the initial building blocks and principles for data spaces that Marco mentioned before. We are involved in this tourism data space, also the manufacturing data space. We are coordinating the Green Deal data space. So it's good to have a general overview of how interoperability could work. And hopefully we will be soon starting the deployment phase of the smart city data space that is mainly led from your country, from Denmark. So I hope that I will have the opportunity to visit your country quite often thanks to that project, where we will really see the deployment challenges and not only the design phase that we have seen so far. So let me go directly to these dates, a European data space for tourism. In this particular case, we are working the business part together with the governance part. So we try not to isolate the different building blocks because they are very much related to each other. And especially one of the things that we want to do is to make sure that through this project, we provide the right incentives for companies in the tourism sector to share data, because we think that maybe sometimes we are providing a lot of conceptual elements and companies are not at all convinced about what is the need to share data, especially because the ones that are already sharing data, they have their mechanisms, their agreements with other companies, and sometimes they have difficulties to understand what the value is. And we are really trying to work out these kind of elements together with the governance and the pure technical interoperability. So here what we have done so far is mainly what all the projects are doing in the different sectors. We've been analyzing what are the conditions of the sector. We have mapped 180 data sharing initiatives. We have already identified like more than 100 priority high value data sets for tourism. And in our deliverables, we provide a good analysis of more than 25 use cases, 8 of them analyzed really in depth with a lot of technical governance and business elements. So I think that they provide a very good background for some of the conclusions we will come up with in the project. In our case, we have already provided an initial version of the architecture and technical building blocks and also the governance framework and the business models for the data space, even though this is still work in progress. It is quite important to say that in the tourism sector, there are already many previous activities and initiatives like the Smart Tourism Destinations or the 100 Intelligent Cities Challenge. I think it's important to have a look at all them and not to reinvent the wheel all the time. So in our case, we are really looking at the reference of the Data Space Support Center, what IDSA is doing, for sure what GaiaX is doing. But I think that there are lots of activities that have already happened in the context of the sector, not only with the support of DG Connect, but also DG Grow. And I think that in terms of interoperability standards, data sets, and data models, metadata, and there was a lot of work already done, and we are really trying to look at them. In terms of consortium, DATES is led by an SME in Spain called Any Solution that works directly in tourism, but we have a lot of very important partners in the tourism sector like Avoris or Outdoor Active, Nextour, or Amadeus, which is basically one of the main technical companies that is providing standards for this sector and basically has a major role in making sure that all the different parties can talk to each other. It's also important to say that in this particular sector, we see the role of public administration as a very important one in setting up and deploying the data space, also in the governance model. For this, we have a partner, which is the Ministry of Tourism in Italy, but they are leading another stakeholder group of more than 25 ministers that are working specifically in tourism. And they are really helping us to shape a bit some of the recommendations that we are providing, especially because tourism is a quite specific sector of sectors. And here we don't only need to take into consideration the regulation at EU level, but there are lots of regulations in the tourism sector that happen at national level, regional, and even local level. So many of them need to be tackled at that level. So it's also important to say that tourism is sometimes is not considered a sector in itself, but it has a big importance. It links with many of the other sectors that have been mentioned today, like smart cities, like mobility, Green Deal, energy. But it's a sector in itself, and in fact, it accounts for more than 10% of the European GDP. And just for you to have a reference, the automotive sector accounts just for 7% of the European GDP. So this one is even more important from that point of view, and this needs to be recognized. So we are really happy that finally there are so many activities happening in terms of building a data space for the tourism sector, which really is fed by a lot of data. However, when you come to the reality, we realize that in tourism, it happens like in many other sectors, and companies only share data when they have the mandate to do so. So this is not happening outside their own boundaries of their own sector. Partners mainly share data with some trusted parties. So I think trust is here a quite important word, as you already mentioned before. And there you can see basically what are the percentages of companies that are already sharing data and in which context they share data. However, based on IDC estimations, we think that all these new rules that the European Commission has created since 2020, when the European Strategy for Data was published, will create the opportunity of 270 billion of additional GDP for the EU. And of course, we are now thinking on how to capitalize all these potential opportunities that still are far from being implemented, because even though we have seen examples, and I think that the mobility data space shown before is a very good example of that, I think that in many sectors, and especially many companies, are still far from having the mechanisms and the tools to really exploit the benefits of data. This shows also a quantification of some of the main KPIs of the data economy. IDC is carrying out a study for the European Commission since 2014, something like that, where we are mainly quantifying the major indicators of the data economy, like how many data scientists do we have in Europe, how many data providers, how many data users. I'm sure Johan knows that very well. So it's called the European Data Market. And last year in the European Big Data Value Forum in Prague, I brought these figures, which were our most updated estimations of the value of the data market, which consists on products and services really based on data, the data economy that agglutinates somehow indirect benefits of the data market in other sectors. But then if you have a look at the right side of the slide, you see where's the value of the data monetization for 3 different scenarios. Baseline in 2030, which means that basically Europe doesn't do anything. Challenge 2030, which means that the conditions for the development of the data economy are not the right ones. And high growth scenario, which makes reference to a scenario where basically the Commission and the companies have the rules, the mechanisms, the trusted environments to make sure that the data economy can flourish. So I think that Dataspaces is a very crucial element in this strategy and will help in data monetization. But as you can see, the figures are still very low. And I think that a lot of companies are not able to monetize data, do not even understand what the concept is. And this applies in particular to the tourism sector. One of the very important things that we are doing in this project, and also thanks to the fact that in IDC we have a lot of market intelligence, is understanding if what we are proposing through the Dataspaces fits well with the strategies of the companies. Because when you go to the market, and I mean not only the front runner companies, because they know what Dataspaces is, but when you go outside, people do not understand what it is. For sure, they are using data. I think that tourism is a sector really based on the usage of data, but it's quite important to understand and align the potential development of data spaces in the future with the strategies of the company. So for this, we have had a look at what are the predictions, and these numbers that you see on the left side of the slide do not mean any priority or anything like that. It's just a way of referring to the different predictions. But we see that companies in the tourism sector will mainly invest in sustainability, digital twins, media networks, security, robotics, NFT, edge, payment options, AI, and voice ordering. All this is very important because the usage of data space should not be separated from the digital transformation path of the different companies and how the different technologies fit with each other. So there should be a strategy in place to use data, to understand how to use internally their data, but also data from other sources. And for example, the deployment of data spaces could go hand in hand with the definition of their strategies to use AI or maybe to build a digital twin. And I think that the example we've seen before is a very good reference for that. So in tourism, we say that the future will really be dominated by the 3 Cs, which are customization, convenience, and conscience. Customization makes reference to the hyper-personalization of services and products. And of course, this involves a lot of data, not only about the customer, because here we really rely a lot on personal data, but also contextual data. Convenience, which makes reference to the integration of the different channels to reach out the customer, to make this transparent and seamless to the customer. And then something that is very important and maybe link also with the potential data space for Green Deal, but not only, is that the aspect of sustainability and sustainable goals is becoming extremely important, not only for the loyalty of the potential customers, but also to convince employees to stay in the company. So it's perceived as a value that will make also the sector retain their own employees, which is a very important part also of these data spaces and in general the digital transformation path for tourism companies, ensuring that they have the right skills, which is not the case nowadays for 99% of the companies. So some interesting aspects we should link with when talking about the deployment of the data spaces. As mentioned, 25% of the IT budget will go to sustainability-focused goals and KPIs. This gives maybe an idea that we should prioritize those data sets that allow companies to understand how to reduce carbon footprint or how to reach better KPIs in terms of sustainability, since this is perceived as a very important value. Then, for example,
Nuria, I just want to tell you we are reaching the end, and there's one question for you out in the chat. So
so then I try to go a bit quickly, and I try to go through the slides because I still have some. I will not stop into that, but you have the slides and you will be able to see all these figures because I think that they are quite interesting. Some reflections. I think that here we really need to think about the difference between big industry and SMEs and destination management organizations, because they are not preparing the same way to get the benefits of the data space. So do we really want to create data space that only offer access to data? I think that through the discussions with many stakeholders, what I've seen is that access to data is not at all enough. In tourism, 99.99% of companies operating in Europe are SMEs or micro SMEs, and they don't have, for example, capabilities to do analytics. So I think that access to data should come also with an ecosystem of providers that provide these analytics and other services, and also maybe access to skills. So all this needs to be in place if we really want this to be used and attract most of the market. Then, of course, they should allow multiplicity of business models to accommodate these different needs and make the data space affordable. We are working specifically on guidance and incentives for companies to share data, because many of them still have the idea that giving their data to others, even though we guarantee the data sovereignty, is like lack of competitiveness. And this brings me to the point of the governance model that should integrate these needs, be compliant with EU rules, and of course, generate trust. So since Mark already mentioned this, I will jump into that, but it's important to understand the level of implementation of the data strategy. And for us, looking a bit at the data space for tourism and the governance model, what it is extremely important is that this governance model should ensure trust. We think that without trust, nothing will happen in this particular market, probably not in the others either. So how do we conceive the governance model in particular for this data space? We have defined this set of elements that we consider that provide a very complete picture of what should be defined. We are still in the process of defining the details for each of these building blocks. Again, as you can see, the baseline is trust, but then we have defined a series of principles. One of them is, for example, the representativity. As mentioned, most of the companies in the sector are SMEs, so for sure they should play a role in the governance model. There should be equal decision making, or maybe I should mention fair distribution of value, and therefore this should lead also to fair decision making procedures. Then from an organizational point of view, of course, we need to tackle business models, the legal structure, scalability, business agreements, operational agreements, and organizational agreements. There is the layer of data management, and maybe I don't go into the details of that because some of my colleagues have already mentioned specifically interoperability at level of standards and protocols, but also there are aspects that are mentioned there. And then for sure, a part related to communication, to be kind of a one-stop shop at sectoral and regional level and to ensure coordination. There should be compliance with ethics, and of course, they should be audited. Somehow they should have the capabilities to be audited. And how do we see this, and what is our proposal in particular in this tourism data space? We see the need to have these rule books, and this has already been mentioned before, but we have also defined another element. This is very much based on the CITRA ongoing work. The partner that is leading our governance work is a new governance that works hand in hand with CITRA, so you can see a lot of elements here. And basically, we see the need to combine a rule book and a role book. We think that data spaces will be really distributed, and there will be data spaces or data ecosystems working at regional, local level, at national level, and then European level. And for this, we consider a model where basically there will be these different levels, and we will inherit the properties of the higher level. So, for example, and this should be something that should guarantee the interoperability at different levels and to avoid duplicates. And so things should not be defined several times. We consider that there are already some organizations at EU level that should be responsible for the definition of these EU regulatory and guidelines rulebooks. Here we have the EDIB, and Johan will talk about that later on, the Parliament, or the institutions like the Dataspace Support Center and Gaia-X that will provide the technical cross-sectoral standard rulebooks. All this should be defined by them. We at our sectorial level should not enter into the details because we should inherit all these properties already defined by the others so that we ensure that at least all the data spaces working in the sector are compliant with those high-level rules. But of course, then there will be some conditions happening specifically at the level of the tourism sector. And here you may be aware that there is already a code of conduct that has been defined a couple of years ago for the tourism sector. But for sure, there will also be some other rules that will apply specifically to each of the data spaces. So as you can see there, we see this open rulebook library where the properties will be inherited from the different levels, and the governance model will be a combination of all of them. And of course, it should be agile enough and flexible enough to add also very concrete additional internal rules decided by the governance body of the very specific tourism data space that may be set up at regional level or at national level. Here we have included. Yeah, I'm finishing.
I need to stop you now because otherwise we won't have time for our last two speakers.
This is the last slide.
Okay.
So without entering into the details of the other thing, we see the potential implementation of this through a structure like this one is just a reference where we see the potential creation of a European tourism data space governance body with some rules defined by the rulebook that I mentioned before, and where we see basically the role of the different entities related to tourism and the interconnection with other data spaces, and for sure with the bodies that will make the definition of the high-level rules that I mentioned before, like the European Data Innovation Board and the data space support organizations. So this is just a potential structure that we are discussing with the stakeholders based on this rulebook and rulebook, and it gives an idea of how the European tourism data space could be implemented. I really invite you to have a look at our deliverables. As mentioned, we have worked a lot on the business aspects, and all these proposal is also describing a deliverable that I think is already published. So I invite you to have a look at that, and I'm happy that I see so many connections with the elements that were mentioned by my previous colleagues in previous presentations. I'm sorry for the time. Thank you very much for the invitation to explain this. 10 minutes is really short, but thank you very much, and I hope this is useful to see another example.
There's one question in the chat. We won't have time for it, but maybe you can just go in. I think you briefly touched upon it, so maybe you can just give a little clarification in the chat for Charlotte. So we have to jump straight to Johan, and I'm sorry we are running behind schedule, but hopefully we can make it all. Johan, you are in DG Connect in the Commission, so you're in the heart of the battle. And we'll talk about the newly established or the Data Innovation Board, or is it almost established?
Yeah, so this is what I'm going to explain. Thank you very much for inviting me. Happy to be with you. I see very, very rich presentations. So of course, there's a lot going on. And I will focus really on the EDIB, the European Data Innovation Board. I will share my slides. So you should be able to see it.
Yeah.
So my name is Johan Bodenkamp. I'm working indeed at the European Commission, DG Connect from Luxembourg. In the Data Innovation and Policy Unit. And we are responsible basically for the data strategy that was launched a few years ago in February 2020 with the big vision, as you explained, Lee, at the very beginning, to create this single European data market where we really have data that can flow freely, across our borders and across the sectors. And in order to gradually get there, it's very ambitious. There's a lot of work to be done, but the idea is, in order to get there progressively, that we work on cross-sectoral horizontal legislation, data legislation on the one hand, and on the other hand, we have been speaking in the European Data Strategy about the establishment of the so-called common European data spaces in strategic sectors for Europe. So agriculture, mobility, we spoke about mobility, we spoke about tourism, and there are some others that have been mentioned and that most of you will be aware about. So basically, with the European Data Strategy, the European Commission is trying to foster the creation of this single data market through legislation, completing the legislation regarding data sharing, data availability, and creating also these common European data spaces. Now, I'm going to focus only here on the EDIB, the European Data Innovation Board. And first of all, I want to say very clearly that the Data Innovation Board finds its origin, its source in the Data Governance Act that has already been mentioned several times, which is, of course, a good sign because it means that it is more and more known because, as some or several of you maybe know, since 4 days exactly, the Data Governance Act is applicable since 24 September. So that's like a little milestone for us. And in this Data Governance Act, there is a focus on, let's say, 3 pillars in order to try to improve data governance on those elements. So you see them here on the screen. It's, to improve the rules and the practices of accessing sensitive data that is held by public sector bodies, according to which rules can you access and reuse those data. The second one has been mentioned also several times, of course, is this framework for new data intermediaries, where really we would like to try to foster this service of data intermediaries the European way, to do it in a neutral way, absolutely neutral. What are the rules for that? And then thirdly, also mentioned already, to create more trust and more transparency with regards to corporate and individual data altruism. So how, under what conditions can these organizations function in order to improve trust among the citizens and the businesses that would like to share data under this header of altruism, so without any commercial interest, of course. And in order to work on all that, including the European data spaces, in the European Data Governance Act, it has been decided to create this so-called European Data Innovation Board. And I'm trying to get to the next slide. There it is. So yeah, so this I already mentioned, right? So the DGA is applying since a few days. And as you were wondering, Leah, what about the EDIP? Does it exist? Does it not exist yet? It almost exists. So being the European Data Innovation Board is currently being finalized. And in the coming weeks, a first constitutive meeting will be organized. Finalized meaning what? It means that, you know, the last member states need to appoint their representatives, and we are finalizing also the call for applications, that is to say, for specific relevant representatives from sectors that are also going to take place in this Data Innovation Board. So coming a bit more into detail, how is it defined? First of all, the European Data Innovation Board is a Commission expert group. That is good to know. It has been defined like that in Article 29, which means that it's going to provide advice and support work of the European Commission. It's a Commission expert group that is, let's say, providing expertise, its expertise to the Commission. And for those who maybe are not aware, all the expert groups are present in the EC Register of Expert Groups. If you would Google that, you would find it immediately, and you will also find the European Data Innovation Board. And if you want to follow it more, what is happening there, you will see that you can find exactly who will be the members of this Data Innovation Board. Of course, it's not there yet today, but it will be there in the coming weeks. You will see the subgroups, and you will see also the results in minutes of the meetings. So I would advise everybody interested to go there and follow a bit the work of this new board. So the Article 29 of the DGA is defining the composition of this Data Innovation Board. So first of all, of course, there will be representatives from the member states, but not just any kind of representatives, but representatives of the competent authorities that the member states themselves have identified for the data intermediation services on the one hand, and for the registration of data altruism organizations on the other hand. And of course, this is regularly a ministry or two ministries, but it can also be an agency or a telecom organization. This is typically something that is defined by each member state. And then once these competence authorities have been defined, which is the case for all the member states in the meantime, they are going to design the representatives. And as I said, we are waiting for the last 3-4 member states to do so that we can actually set up this board. Then you see that there are some representatives related, let's say, European organizations, if I may say so, related to data and data protection. So the European Data Protection Board, the European Data Protection Supervisor, the European Agency for Cybersecurity, which is called ENISA. Of course, the Commission is there as well, and then also representatives from small and middle-priced enterprises, so either the SME envoy or any representative that is appointed. And then lastly, these other relevant representatives from bodies in sectors or with specific expertise. And for this part, we have launched a call for applications in June. And we received, of course, a certain number of applications. We have requested representatives in a certain number of important sectors, so agriculture, manufacturing, and some others. And this call for applications is now also being, let's say, finalized internally, so that, again, in the coming weeks, the first meeting of this EDIP can take place. Now, the DGA also immediately explains that there will at least be 3 subgroups. So at least meaning that others can be created if it's felt necessary. But let's say that we will start with at least these 3. So there will be a first one that is really composed of the member state representatives, focusing on, again, the data intermediation services and the data algorithm organizations. Then there will be a subgroup for technical discussions. So you will see if you go to the DGA that an important part of the work of ADIP is also related to standards, common standards, interoperability issues. I mean, it has been mentioned several times, of course, here in this webinar. If we want to make the European data spaces work, first of all, intra-data space, but if we want to make true common European data spaces, meaning that in the end, they will all be connected and we will have a Europe-wide data space in the field of agriculture or the Green Deal. Of course, interoperability and cross-sectoral common standards are vital. So this is an important part of the work of this ADIP. And then there will also be a specific subgroup for the involvement of these, let's say, representatives from industry, research, academia, etc. So to make sure that, of course, it is not only member states, but it's also members from relevant other sectors, industry, as mentioned here, right? Industry, research, academia, civil society, standardization organizations, etc., and even the relevant common European data spaces. Now, this is a nice picture that that the DSSC actually made, and that I like a lot because it is trying to regroup in a bit of a comestible way what exactly the ADIP is going to do, because they have a lot of tasks, as you can see. Now, maybe this is difficult to grasp immediately, but you will see that there is a lot of work going on in trying to make sure that there is a consistent practice, and related to that, that you will develop consistent guidelines to make, let's say, these 3 pillars of the DGA work. Again, the pillar of accessing and reusing sensitive data that is held by public authorities, the data altruism organizations, and of course the data intermediaries. In order to make that really work in a consistent way, the ADIP is going to work on guidelines, is going to work on several elements in order to try to bring this practice in a consistent way across the Union. And you will see on the right-hand side at the top that they will also specifically propose guidelines for the common European data spaces. Now, when we say common European data spaces, we refer specifically to the ones that were mentioned in the European data strategy. And then after the European data strategy, some others were announced, typically tourism, for example. You will see in the European data strategy initially 10 sectors, and then 4 have been added afterwards in the last years: cultural heritage, language, tourism, and media. So those are the ones that we currently refer to as common European data spaces, because we all know that data spaces, a lot of data space initiatives exist in Europe and beyond, which is a good sign because we need all of them. But when we refer to common European data spaces, for the moment, we refer to these ones that are, let's say, actively stimulated, supported, fostered by the EU, by the European Commission. Now, if you look more in detail to this Article 30H of the DGA, that says that the ADIP is going to propose guidelines for the common European data spaces. Again, there is a lot of elements that you can read that will be taken into account in these guidelines that are going to be proposed. But I just wanted to point out that you see under 4 at the bottom that it should also specifically address the adequate and non-discriminatory representation of relevant stakeholders in the governance of common European data spaces. So, as we have heard since the beginning of this webinar, governance is there at several levels, is a very complex concept. It's about all the rules and the legislation that make a common European data space work at several levels. But you see here that a specific element, meaning the fair participation of relevant stakeholders in a common European data space and in the governance of a common European data space more specifically, is an element that needs to be taken into account specifically by this European Data Innovation Board when proposing these guidelines. Now, there is a very specific and direct and important link between this new European Data Innovation Board and the Dataspaces Support Center that we know, and there are several representatives in this webinar, which is of course a very good sign, because the Dataspaces Support Center can almost celebrate its first year of anniversary, because it started in October last year and will last for 3.5 years. And one of the specific tasks set out for the Dataspaces Support Center is to support the work of this Data Innovation Board. So the Dataspaces Support Center is working on a lot of elements, and I will not go into that because several before me have already shown elements of the work of the DSSC. And all this knowledge and all these elements will be taken into account when supporting the work of the ADEP. So there is a strong link that is going to be established there. And of course, we will see in the coming weeks and months how this is going to be organized. And as a final one, when we look at, again, specifically the so-called common European data spaces, we see for the moment 3 important actors that will also or groups of actors, if I may say so, that has a very important influence also on all the governance aspects. First of all, obviously, the Dataspaces Support Center. And here the focus is really on the coordination of all these relevant actions on sectoral data spaces in Europe. So that's their focal point. How can we do this in a consistent way, not reinventing the wheel, helping any other kind of initiatives to create a data space that can be part of this whole family, because in the end, we want all the common European data spaces to be interconnected and to gradually arrive at this so-called single European data market. And then you see that the second one are these so-called specific sectoral or domain-specific initiatives, so coordination and support actions followed regularly by deployment actions. So we heard Nuria with the tourism preparatory action to prepare the ground for a common European tourism data space. And others are taking place in the other sectors. Now they all look specifically what are the needs for this specific sector, for this specific domain, but they are working from the outset together with the Dataspaces Support Center, again, in order to avoid that there will be new silos, and to make sure that everything is as much as possible being consistent, allowing this easy interconnection. And then finally, soon in the coming weeks, we will have this European Data Innovation Board that is going to work from the Data Governance Act perspective on various data governance elements. So again, these 3 pillars on sensitive data from public authorities, the data altruism organizations, the data intermediary services, and also working in that context on proposing guidelines for the common European data spaces, taking into account also important aspects on interoperability, common standards, etc. So I wanted to stop here, and if there are any questions, I would be happy to take them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Otto, for keeping time and making this overview in the end. Just so the middle part, I think, just to clarify for people, these are all the funded projects that the that the Digital Europe program is funding right now. So, for example, the Smart and Sustainable Cities data space that is mentioned. We have one question from Charlotte here, who says, or I'm not sure that it's a question, but it's about the part in the DGA where it says, is that the DGA? No, that must be in the Data Act. I'm not sure about that the government can require to have access to data in specific situations. I think this is what Charlotte is referring to. I'm not 100% sure.
I indeed believe that this may refer rather to the Data Act and the business to government data sharing. That is to say, to see in what situations of extreme urgency and importance public authorities can require data in order to deal with this urgency. So typically what has happened with COVID and where important initiatives, data initiatives has helped to better understand what's going on with this pandemic and how we can combat it. I don't know, is there a specific question here? So how do the Dataspaces?
And I think this is, I would like to discuss it, but I think we're getting a bit out of the scope because we don't have enough time for it. But I know this is something that is being heavily discussed among private companies who are very concerned about this. So, and other things in the Data Act.
Yeah, I suppose that
I
there
think
will
I
be
can
more sessions
actually
coming up.
adhere to the Danish standard has and will have, I think, a webinar that will be relevant for the Data Act and for stuff in that soon. So Bjørn, if you're with us, maybe you can post a link to this webinar that is coming up in some weeks. I also have a lot of questions, but we don't have time for it. But thank you very much for clarifying this. We're looking very much forward to seeing who will be part of this Data Innovation Board. And I guess this also means that, Adam, that the Danish, that the Agency of Digitization have now proposed who should actually be joining this board from the Danish side, and also a lot of other things it seems that you have been busy with, since it's only 4 days ago that you should have implemented the different parts in the Data Governance Act. So please let us know what you've done so far.
Sure. Can you see my presentation?
Yes, it's perfect.
Great. I can't, so that's why I'm asking.
Okay.
I'll try to speed run some EU legislation in 5 or maybe 10 minutes. Because essentially, the way I see it, there are 3 broad and a number of sector-specific EU acts that are relevant for Dataspaces, immediately relevant. First one being the Open Data Directive, which is the oldest, the grandfather of the data legislation in the EU. Which was, it's so old that it was actually a directive. So we've implemented that in Danish law. And it sets an outer framework of the conditions that can be set for reuse of open public sector data. It's important that it's data that can be opened. And my second bullet here is very central, that the Open Data Directive does not mandate the publication or making available of data. It just says that when an authority decides to make data available, then they have to comply with the rules about the conditions, that they have to be non-discriminatory, they can't be financially prohibitive, and the data must be documented, and so on and so forth. The main new thing about the Open Data Directive, which used to be called the PSI Directive, is that it introduces the concept of high-value data sets, which have to be free, have to be documented especially well, and have to be available through APIs, and in many cases also download services. We are currently working on getting the identified high-value data sets marked up as such on the Open Data portal in Denmark, which is the national single access point, I believe the term is in the ODD. And the deadline for that work is June next year. So flying on to that sort of sets the baseline for making public sector data available for Dataspaces. And the DGA then goes further, as Johan also mentioned and others mentioned earlier, in setting similar rules as the ODD does, but for protected public sector data, meaning personal data and commercially confidential data and so on. As the regulation is very new, it is, I would say, not fully established what the effect will be in the real world of this. But we also have to have a central point for publishing metadata about the datasets made available under the DGA. That again is datavejviser.dk, the Danish open data portal, or public sector data portal, as we like to call it. And then the DGA also introduces, again, as has been mentioned several times today, the concepts of data intermediaries and data altruism. We are very uncertain, again, whether that will actually have a real-world effect in Denmark, because the idea is to set a common legal framework for people making data available to the facilitating the data sharing between data holders and data users. Whether that is necessary in a Danish context is an open question, because actually that was legal in Denmark before the DGA. And the DGA imposes some rather harsh restrictions on especially data intermediaries. They are not allowed to use the data that they mediate for any services they themselves produce. And that is that might be problematic for some businesses. But my agency, the Danish Agency for Digital Government, is responsible for handling registrations of data intermediaries and data altruistic organizations. Very easy to say. We also counsel about that and so on. The EDIB I won't talk about, as Johan covered that admirably. The final act has been alluded to just before I went on, the Data Act, which it is true that it does have rules about when the public sector can demand data from private organizations in emergencies. I don't think that's too relevant for Dataspaces, because it's not, it is an emergency measure. But the Data Act will support Dataspaces when it is finalized by ensuring portability of product-generated data, as the term is. That's all the data that is generated by our robot vacuum cleaners and our cars and our smartwatches and everything. We get the right with the Data Act to access that data and to give it to third parties, certain third parties. We can't give it to Google and Amazon, but we can give it to a lot of other businesses. I expect it to be formalized before New Year, so that it can come into effect in 2025 and to 2027, because it's staged, because there is quite substantial implementation demands on businesses and so in some cases authorities. We haven't really finalized that yet. So with that, there are other regulations that are relevant for Dataspaces. Of course, the specific Dataspace regulations that are currently proposed, the EHDS and the PPDS, and probably more to come. But I would also like to mention IDAS and the SDG regulations, because they aim to establish technical infrastructures for data sharing and for trust sharing. And I think that's about what I could pull time for from this. So thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So there's been some discussions in the chat, but I think it's concerning, and that's, I think, the problem, overall problem of Dataspaces, that there's so many different terms, and we use sometimes the same terms for different parts of the value chain, you can say. So we talk about authorities in terms of creating a data space, but we also talk about the public authorities having the right to something. So these are two different entities here. But I think especially for the Data Act, there's a link to a webinar that the Danish Standard will host, and where the Ministry of Digitization will also get more into what does it mean, and the things that has been decided upon in the Data Act. And as you say, Adam, this, especially the part about IoT and digital services, the data that is being produced through this actually belongs to me, who is the user of the service, rather than the one who's providing the service. And I should have access to that data in a readable format, or like not only in a proprietary interface, you could say, and I should be able to take that data with me. So if I want to have another service provider, let's say for my Google Home stuff, then I can actually reuse that data. And the same goes for specifically for cloud services. It should be easier to switch cloud service. And so I just look at my questions. So if there's some overall questions, please come with them now. I'm just trying to follow here. Otherwise, I'm just curious, Adam, if anyone sits now and say, but we have ideas for wanting to do establish a data space, making a data space authority or a governance body, and we want to get started, where should we actually go? Should we go to you, or should we go to your hand down in the commission, or should we go to the Data Space Support Center? How do we actually get started with this?
The short and work-inducing answer for me is call me as the first port of call, and then we'll figure out what to do from there.
Great. And Johan also mentioned, so you have now appointed one specific person to join the European Data Innovation Board. And
actually, we have appointed two.
What?
We've actually appointed two.
Okay, good.
But yes, we are not among the stragglers who still need to appoint.
And as I understood, we will also appoint specific people from the different sectors. Is that right, Johan? It wasn't totally clear for me. It seems like that's a call that you have out, or is that
Sorry,
is that on a national level?
Question? Sorry, can you
I was just curious about the sector-specific people who should be appointed in the EDIB. Is that from each country also? Will we have one from energy in Denmark, one from tourism in Denmark?
No, indeed. So it has been decided to keep the board up to a number that would still allow to work in let's say in a more or less efficient way. Of course, you can have all sorts of opinions on what is efficient and how many people can still be efficient, but it means concretely that the EDIB will be composed of normally 40 representatives, knowing already that 27 come from the member states. And in the call of applications to cover specific expertise and specific sectors, it was specified that these sectors would be agriculture, mobility, environment, manufacturing, health, and energy. And there we would like to appoint a representative Europe-wide that could well represent these specific sectors and interests.
So would that typically be people who are already joining some of the more sector-specific EU work in, for example, the whole strategy about digitizing the energy sector in Europe, for example?
For example, of course, it
Yeah.
all depends on the applications that we have received. But normally the ones that have specifically applied for these sectors consider themselves to be an expert Europe-wide to cover, for example, health-related issues or manufacturing-related issues. So among the ones that have applied, we are selecting the representative that, according to us, can best take up that responsibility.
Great. And there's one thing that I also did not see in your slide about what is your task. So it seems like you are also the ones who should actually keep track of or giving the specific blueprint or stamp for the intermediaries out there who wants to be a recognized EU data intermediary. Is that true?
Yes, that is correct. You can see it like that. So the Data Governance Act indeed specifies under what conditions data intermediaries need to be notified, what are the requirements, and there will all the member states, they will have a national registry, and at EU level there will be one place where you can see Europe-wide what data intermediation services do, let's say, fulfill all these criteria and can therefore be really considered neutral data intermediaries in the sense of the Data Governance Act, and therefore hopefully increase trust and make sure that all the data holders and the data users that want to go to a trusted neutral intermediary without the fear that their data is going to be used maybe by this data intermediary for other personal purposes, that in this way, of course, the role of data intermediaries will be increased and we will increase data sharing.
And the full list of requirements, is that now available, or is that what is stated in the DGA?
That is exactly stated in the DGA, indeed.
So that means if anyone out there, I know that we, for example, have in Denmark something that could look like a data intermediary, for example, within energy. So if you want to look into what do we actually need to apply to in order to or comply with in order to apply for this, this is in the DGA that we see this.
Yeah, I have also placed a link in the chat, the DGA explained, so in let's say more accessible language with all sorts of references and links for more detailed information.
And then when you look into that and think we still don't understand it, then maybe we'll contact Adam first, and then
Actually, you should contact a different department at Digitaliseringsstyrelsen. Kontor for Digital Regulering og Tilsyn. Is responsible for registering data intermediaries and data altruists.
Maybe you will forward anyone who contacts.
I'll happily forward it.
So there's a lot still going on in this area, and the governance is definitely not totally, we couldn't nail it totally into saying 3 bullet points. It's a very complex term, but at least a lot of people are working on making it more concrete for us, and also to do some kind of cookbooks, rule books for how do we actually get started with this, just to not scare everyone away. So we are already 2 minutes over time. I want to thank you all for joining in, and you'll get the slides from me. And there's also still a lot of discussion out in the chat that you can look at afterwards. So thank you very much for today. And I'll send the link also to the recording also to all of you. Bye.
Thank you very much. Have a nice day.
Have a nice day.
Thank you all. Have a nice day.
Thank you.